I told him,
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anthony Long, and welcome to our May meeting for the Pacific Northwest Historians Guild. Before we get started, I have a few announcements that I would like to share with you all, and I'm going to share my slideshow. It's like, again, to welcome you all to our May meeting. And just a little bit about our organization. The Pacific Northwest Historians Guild brings together scholars, teachers, students, and anyone interested in the preservation, development, and dissemination of Pacific Northwest history. Founded in 1980, the Guild fosters teaching and appreciation of Pacific Northwest history and promotes communication among regional historians. For more information about our organization, you can visit us at pnwhistorians.org, or you can find us on Facebook at PNWHG. If you're interested in becoming a member, we have memberships available. For individual memberships, it's $35. For students, $15. Institutional memberships is $100, and lifetime memberships are $250. Again, if you're interested, you can visit us at pnwhistorians.org and sign up if you want to. Also, we are pleased to announce that this year we'll be having our history conference on October 11th at the Seattle Public Library. It's a free day-long conference on a Saturday. It's a fascinating look at a wide variety of topics. We would like to thank our sponsors for their generous support, the Washington State Historical Society, For Culture, and the Seattle Public Library. This year's conference title is called Challenging History. You join us to share your experience of meeting challenges faced in interpreting, teaching, or preserving history, or in telling stories of those who have faced challenges in our region's history. And tonight, I would like to introduce both of our speakers, John Lundin and his brother Steve Lundin. Uh, a little background on John. John grew up in Seattle. John and Steve grew up in Seattle and John spent his professional career practicing law, initially in Washington, D.C., and then in Seattle. John also has a master's in urban and regional planning and worked in the areas of land use and environmental law, served on boards of nonprofit corporations, and was a longtime legal counsel for the Seattle Audubon Society. John considers himself to be on a sabbatical from the law as he pursues his interest in history and writing, splitting his time between Seattle and Sun Valley, Idaho. He has participated in sports his whole life and is a lifelong skier and a longtime rower. John is a proud product of the West, where his family members were early settlers and pioneers. Drawn initially by hard rock mining. He has done in-depth research into his family's history for books he is writing and has written extensively about early skiing history. A number of John's history essays are available on historylink.org, the online encyclopedia of Washington history, Central Washington's website for local authors, the community library in Ketchum, Idaho, and other locations. Steve's also a former lawyer, served in the Washington State Legislature. He specialized in government law. Uh, since since his since he transitioned, he also became a historian and has written books on public law and Native American settlements in the South Puget Sound. He is a resident of Panorama, Washington, just outside of Olympia. For to questions for tonight's speakers, you can please put your questions into the chat icon as you see on the screen here, and we'll wait to the end where we'll have a question and answer session for the speakers. With that, I would like to hand over the reins to John and Steve to talk about their newest book.
Thank you, Anthony. Let me get this up here. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and thanks, Anthony, for the introduction. And my brother and I are here to talk about our latest book, which is my sixth book and his fourth book, From Cheechakos to Sourdoughs, Two Ivy Leaguers' Quest for Yukon Gold. The book is basically an adventure story about two New Yorkers, our grandfather Mark Odell and his best friend Ellis Aldrich, who caught gold fever and dropped out of Cornell Law School in March of 1898 to spend a year seeking their fortunes by mining for gold in the Klondike region of Canada. The book's based on original materials, including Odell's diary, the men's articles written for their hometown New York newspapers, and letters to their families. It contains many of the over 100 photographs taken by the party using one of the original Kodak cameras available to the public. Their story is not just one of adventurers seeking gold in one of the harshest environments in the world. It's a story of well-educated college graduates who describe the challenges of their year in the wilderness from the perspective of their Ivy League education. Now, just a note about the title. Cheechako in the Chinook jargon is a term for a newcomer who's not yet spent a winter in the Yukon. The sourdough, on the other hand, is an experienced prospector who spent at least one winter in the Yukon. And indeed, that's the journey of these two men. They went up there being totally inexperienced as Cheechakos, spent a year in very harsh conditions, and came out as sourdoughs. I should say that even though I'm doing the presentation today, my brother Steve is the primary scholar for the book. He wove together information from multiple sources to make a unified adventure story and presents original research that he's done about the gold rush that is found in the appendices to the book. Among other things, Steve hiked over Chilkoot Pass twice and located the area where our grandfather mined for gold outside of Fort Selkirk. Now, we'll start out with pictures of Steve and me. That's me and that's Steve. This picture was taken by Seattle Times reporter Gene Sherrod, who does the article Seattle Now and Then. And this was in front of where Schwabacher's Wharf was, where in July 17th, 1897, the ship carrying a ton of gold arrived from Alaska, and it's starting the gold rush. And in July, Gene will be doing an article on the gold rush in the book, as close to July 17th as it can get. It'd be great publicity for us in the book. Now, I mentioned the original research that Steve did. It's not only contained in the book, but you can find it in depth in the appendices. He's done brand new in-depth research on Fort Selkirk, the Postal Service in the Yukon, the Dalton Trail, the White Pass and Yukon route, and the Winter River Trail that was used by our grandfather to return home. So he's found a lot of information that simply isn't discussed in other books about the gold rush. I mentioned the daily diary. This is an example of 2 pages. Odell was called himself as a man of letters. He was very literate. He was a wonderful writer. And he made daily entries that really described everything he did. For example, every penny he paid for any item was noted in here. So he was very fastidious. Now, the Odell party has over 100 pictures taken by this very camera, or one like it. It's one of the first Kodak cameras available to the public. It was produced and sold between 1895 and 1913. In those days, it cost $8, and you had film that had 12 pictures producing 3.5 by 3.5 inch negatives. And on the right here, you can see how the person taking the pictures took track of them, kept track of them. This is roll number 5, And the pictures are indicated 1 through 12 exactly where they were taken. So that's how we can identify the times and places. Although, as Steve has told you in the book, they weren't as fastidious for a number of the roles. Now, these are the two principal characters. On the left is Mark Odell, and the right is Ellis Aldridge. And these were their Cornell graduation pictures when they graduated in 1897. Now, Odell was from a farming family in upstate New York, and Aldrich was from Brooklyn, New York. So they seemed to be polar opposites, but they met and bonded their first year at Cornell and became fast and furious friends. They bonded over debate, over student politics, and sports. Aldrich played on Cornell's baseball team, and Odell rode on the very famous Cornell crew of 1897. Now, in these days, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, um, rowing was by far the most popular intercollegiate sport. It was dominated initially by Harvard and Yale, who thought they were so good they would only row against each other. But in 1897, they decided to let Cornell into their group, who they saw as country bumpkins. And the match race took place on the Poughkeepsie in New York. And it had international implications. Yale had an English coach, and Harvard had an English trained coach. And everyone believed that the refined English stroke would win over the very awkward Cornell stroke that their coach had developed. Well, to everyone's surprise, Cornell won handily, rowing away by many, many lengths. And they rowed a 4-mile course in those days, which is phenomenal. The courses now are 2,000 meters. So in those days, rowing was really a challenge. The picture you see on the left is from an English magazine called The Sketch, and it shows the Cornell, Yale, and Harvard crews because it was followed extensively in England. And the race was seen by 100,000 spectators. And on the right, you can see the picture of the national champion crew from Cornell. Our grandfather is in seat number 5, rowing port. And you can see this grand yacht in the background. The race attracted many wealthy patrons of rowing who came and saw the race. There's Pop Courtney, their coach, and Cornell dominated intercollegiate rowing for a decade and a half after 1897. And the Courtney or Cornell stroke won the day. This is actually a picture of a picture that still hangs in the Cornell boathouse of the 1897 championship crew. So it's still held in very high esteem. Now we're talking generally or specifically about the gold rush of 1898. But the reason it was very significant in and of itself, but it had greater significance because it was the event that ended the International Silver Depression that started in 1888 and lasted for a decade. And it was so severe, it was said to be worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. Silver prices took a tumble. Silver prices, that was one of the backers of the U.S. currency, went down until May 3rd, 1893, the day known as Black Friday, when there was no market for silver. And other weaknesses in the national economy caused the failure of railroads, banks, investment companies, and manufacturing companies, setting off a widening national depression. And it ended what was known as the Gilded Age. Now you can see on the right the actual article from the CLPI announcing Black Friday. And so this really devastated the U.S. economy and threw people out of work all over the country. It's Black Friday, panic reigns on Wall Street as stock drops with rush. Now, here's what the pundits say, the historians. The Silver Depression ended dramatically, almost overnight, by a single event. Just as the outbreak of World War II ended the Great Depression, the Klondike Gold Rush ended the Depression of the 1890s. The gold rush actually started on July 17th, 1897, when the steamer Portland, carrying a ton of Klondike gold, reached Seattle. And before a week passed, newspapers were announcing that depression was over and money was circulating again. Picture on the left is the Portland, bringing the ton of gold to Seattle. And on the right is the Seattle Times headline announcing its arrival. Gold, gold, gold. 68 rich men on the steamer Portland. Stacks of yellow metal. Some have 5,000, a few bring over 100,000. Steamer carries $700,000. So you can imagine the excitement this caused because all of a sudden the depression was over and people had this magical opportunity to go to the Klondike and get rich themselves. Seattle quickly became the gateway to the Klondike, much of it due to the results of the person you see on the right there, Erastus Brainerd, who was a publicist working for Seattle PI and the Chamber of Commerce, who the historians say sold the idea to the country that Seattle was a gateway to Alaska and the only such portal. And Seattle became the jumping off point for the gold rush. 70,000 Klondikers came through Seattle, spending on average $500 apiece for supplies that were required by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to get into Canada, enough to last 1 year. And by spring of 1898, more than $25 million had been spent in Seattle for outfitting. And remarkably, that's worth $963 million in 2025 values, which is pretty remarkable. 100,000 people started for the Klondike, but only 33,000 made it because of the rigors of the trip, and fewer than 3,000 actually discovered gold. The majority of the people going there arrived after the best gold prospects around Dawson City had been claimed. And the Klondike Gold Rush formally ended in 1899 when gold was discovered near Nome, Alaska, where the Yukon River enters the Bering Strait, and that prompted an exodus from the Klondike north. Now, this is from the PI article here is from September 1897 that shows Brainerd's work. Seattle opens the gate to the Klondike gold fields, and he made sure that newspapers in every city in the country got copies of that. So Odell and Aldrich in 1898 were actually in Cornell Law School, and they caught gold fever. It's interesting how quickly things happened. On March 2nd, 1898, the two of them first discussing dropping out of Cornell Law School and go to the Klondike. And they left on March 16th, 2 weeks later, after making all the arrangements they had to, arranging with their family, dropping out of school. Odell was rowing on the Cornell crew of 1898, and they were disappointed to see him go. And one of the things they did that made it possible is that they formed an association with a person identified only as Mr. Smith, who was a businessman from Ithaca, New York. And Steve is determined that this was L.C. Smith, the manufacturer of typewriters and weapons. And their association, he basically organized them to search for Klondike gold. He agreed to pay their expenses and assured them of liberal compensation. So 2 weeks later, on March 16th, they left New York for the Klondike, traveled by train to St. Paul, and then by Northern Pacific to Seattle, where the gold rush started. And Odell has a number of interesting quips in his diary. One of the things he said is on the train going to Seattle, he spotted two suspicious girls in our lower berth. When you think about it, their decision to go to the Klondike was remarkable. It's the end of a 10-year depression. You can understand how people who are unemployed would want to go, people who were marginally employed and didn't have a way to earn a good living. Gold rushes have always attracted those people. But both Odell and Aldrich had graduated from an Ivy League school at a time when very few people had college degrees. And in those days, if you had a college degree, law school was only 1 year. So in March, they were two months away from graduating from law school and, likely ensuring themselves of a very high level paying position. But notwithstanding that, the lure of Yukon gold was such that They decided to leave school and go. And that shows how strong the attraction was. So what do you do when you get to Seattle, as 70,000 people did? Well, the picture on the left is one everyone has seen. There are a whole bunch of them. The demand for goods was so great that the Seattle merchants piled their goods outside their stores for easy selling. You know, you don't know what to take. Well, the merchants would tell you. On the right is one of the outfitters that told you exactly what to have. On the left-hand column, it was all the clothing and other gear, and on the right was the list of food and provisions you need. And lo and behold, we'll give you the list and we'll show you everything. Now, there were three alternate routes to the gold rush. On the very right, it was the land-based route from Alberta, Canada, that took people overland to Dawson. The second started from Seattle. It was called the Rich Man's Route. It went by steamship all the way up to just south of Nome to a place called St. Michael. And they would get another steamship that would take them all the way up to the Yukon River to Dawson. So they had no hiking to do. They didn't have to carry their provisions. They rode the whole way, but it was quite expensive. So that left the third option, which was called the Poor Man's Route, that was taken by Aldrich and Odell. And that started in Seattle, went the Inland Passage up to Skagway, and then to Dyea and over Chilkoot Pass and up the Yukon River, ultimately to Dawson. And as the headline says, the quest for gold was no quick trip. This map shows you a little more about where the Yukon Territory is. Here it is in green. It abuts on the west, Alaska. On the north, it goes to the Beaufort Sea, and on the right, there's Northwest Territories. On the south is British Columbia, and the Yukon River goes all the way through to Alaska. And the map on the right here shows in orange the Klondike region of Yukon Territory. And this was the area of the actual gold rush. And Dawson City was the center of it, and it's where the Klondike River came into the Yukon River. Odell and Aldrich actually stopped here, which is Fort Selkirk. It's where the Pelly River comes into the Yukon River. And here's a very simple map showing the route that the poor men took. You start at Skagway, you go up to Dyea, you go over Chilkoot Pass, you go down a series of lakes to Bennett Lake, where 10,000 people built their boats, then up the Yukon River to Fort Selkirk, where our party stopped, and all the way to the Klondike River. It was 400 miles from Dyea to Fort Selkirk and 550 miles up to Dawson. And keep in mind, that was rough going, and you had to take several thousand pounds of your supplies with you. There's an alternate route that developed later over White Pass. In 1899, the White Pass and Yukon Railroad was finished, going from Skagway all the way to Whitehorse, that became a major town. And once that was done, it eliminated the route over Chilkoot Pass. This map shows you generally how big the Yukon River is. That's in yellow there. Starts in British Columbia, goes all the way through Yukon Territory, then meanders through Alaska, goes to the Bering Strait, and there's Nome there, and St. Michael is where you pick up the steamboat and go back if you're a rich man. Now, the first stage of the trip north started in Seattle, and the Alki is actually the vessel that the party went up on. And here you can see a picture of the Odell party actually being loaded on the boat. The lower left shows some horses being winced on board that went north with them. And the gold rush was such a thing in Seattle back in the day, is that every time a boat came or boat left, there'd be a huge flock of people there just to see what was happening. And this is a professional picture showing another boat and the kind of crowd sending it off that you'd find in those days. It was definitely a big social event. Now, Odell has a number of wonderful descriptions of the trip north that he said was grand, filled with wondrous beauties. He talked about the wild ducks, the whales that would spout and roll around, and the schools of porpoises that would find them. And his summary of the trip was, should I return from Utah, from the Yukon Valley without an ounce of dust? I cannot regret the time spent after passing over this part of the route. Keep in mind, this was a farmer from upstate New York who'd never been out of state before, so that the passage north was truly wondrous. And that the picture on the upper right is taken from the Alki looking north, and the lower one is at Wrangell, one of the stops on the way. Now, it was fairly common in these days for partnership groups to form to mine, broke up and changed. And Odell and Aldrich initially were part of a party controlled and financed by Mr. Smith. On the train to Seattle, they met and joined a four-member Thompson party that eventually broke up. They later joined with two other people, Walt Hoagland and Tom Wood, and they started prospecting at Wolverine Creek outside of Fort Selkirk with 9 others, including Hoagland and Wood. And then the party broke up and Wood left for home. And finally, the last party was formed. Odell and Aldrich joined with Hoagland and Granger to build a cabin and mine for gold from August 1898 to February 1899. Now, the day they arrived in Skagway, which was the first step going into the Yukon goldfields, they were met with horrible news. And you could see the bulletin that they read. It was the Palm Sunday avalanche, a disastrous avalanche. Many encounter sudden death on the trail. Snowslide near the scales engulfs hundreds. And that was the Palm City avalanche that happened on April 3rd, 1898, between Sheep Camp and the RCMP scales on the Chilkoot Trail. And Odell's diary said, snowslide on Chilkoot this night, killed many. Dubious tales of the Daae route, which is the way they were going to go. And numerous snowslides occurred that day, and 65 people were killed. And Odell wrote to his hometown newspaper, I've witnessed many a sad sight here, the result of that terrible affair. And of course, they were just starting out on that same route, so this was not good news to start. This is a map that actually shows the first route, first portion of the route that they took. They went from Skagway in the lower left here. Their goods were taken by boat to Dyea, and then they had to hike and haul their goods. This is called the Chilkoot Trail to Canyon City Sheep Camp, up to the RCMP scales where they were weighed and duties imposed, then over Chilkoot Pass, which was the big barrier, and then down through a series of lakes to Bennett Lake, where most of the boats were built. And the trail up to Chilkoot Pass was called the meanest 32 miles in the world, and went from sea level up Chilkoot Pass to a 3,500-foot summit. And here's a map of the entire way that kind of condenses everything. Again, start at Skagway, Dyea, Chilkoot Pass, Lake Bennett. And in Lake Bennett, you'd pick up what's now known as the Yukon River. The upper portion had a different name in those days. And you go down the Yukon River through Whitehorse, Lake LaBarge, where Sam McGee was cremated on its marge, according to Robert Service, and then all the way up down the Yukon River, actually. And here's Fort Selkirk, where the Pelly River comes in, and all the way up to Dawson, where most of the people went. 400 miles to Lake Fort Selkirk, 550 to Dawson. So an incredibly long distance. And this shows what the Odell party did after arriving. This shows the harbor, the port at Skagway, and then this shows Dyea, how busy it was when all the goods were over there. And so Odell and Aldrich had 3,000 pounds of goods they had to take all the way up over Chilkoot Pass. Well, how do you do that? You carry some, you use mules, you use dog sleds, and every other way of going, but just imagine how bulky 3,000 pounds of supplies are. And from Dai up to Sheep Camp required, according to historians, a superhuman effort to transport those thousands of pounds up that narrow, slippery, rocky trail of the pass, through boulder-strewn canyons, across swampy bottomland. And some prospectors took 3 months to move their goods from Dai to Chilkoot Pass summit, although there were packers who could transport their goods for a fee. And the picture in the bottom left was the group of four that Odell and Aldrich hooked up with. Two of the people, including Tom Wood and Walt Hoagland, who later joined them separately, are here. And that was taken at Sheep Camp. And this is a professional photograph, but this goes from Sheep Camp up to the RCMP scales that are further up there. And you can see how rough the trail is. This is no walk in the park. And, every part of the route into the Yukon was fraught with hazards and very difficult. This, of course, is Chilkoot Pass, or the Golden Stairs. It had 1,500 steps rising 1,000 miles and a half mile. And there are many, many of the professional photographs of this where it looks like, a single group of people going up there. Odell said from a distance, it looks much like a string of toiling ants creeping up a small mound. And every 15 or 20 feet are resting places where the weary packer steps out of line to rest his shoulders and catch his breath. And a single trip up the Golden Stairs could take up to 6 hours. And it was said that men walked 80 miles for each mile they moved their goods. And it'd take 40 trips up, hiking 1,000 miles to take all your goods to the summit. And take a look at what they're carrying. These weren't fancy Kelty packs. They're carrying boxes, bags, and loads of probably 50 to 100 pounds, doing it time after time after time. On lower right, you can see a picture taken by Steve on one of his trips over at Chilkoot Pass in the summertime, and you can see how rough the terrain was. This was definitely no walk in the park. Now, Odell in his diary described his climbing up Chilkoot Pass. He said, I packed 2 sacks of flour, 50 pounds each on my first trip up, which would be 100 pounds per trip. Going up the last hill, the one thing in my mind was that last mile at Poughkeepsie last year when he was rowing in the national championship. And he was straining his ears to hear the coxswain shout, "Give her 25, boys," which is the coxswain's call for a sprint. Now, many of the commentators talk about the trip up, but keep in mind, the packers had to take multiple trips. So how do you get down? Well, Odell told us you slide down on your rear end, and here's one of his pictures showing that. And he said the funniest sight is a return trip with the packers down the summit. It's too steep to walk. They sit down and slide in long grooves in the snow, worn by many slides down in many days. I tried it yesterday. It came down like a whirlwind. It gives one very accelerating sensation coming down, and quite like a moist sensation after it gets down. The regular packers reinforce their garments with a piece of canvas or sealskin. So I don't know who those people are, but that's the route down. And this is a picture of the Odell party at the summit of Chilkoot Pass, resting from their long labors. Now, once you get over Chilkoot Pass, you have to take your 3,000 pounds of supplies 14 miles down to Lake Bennett. And Odell described this in a letter to his hometown newspaper written when they were down at Bennett Lake. It's an awful job to get our goods from the summit to Bennett Lake. We had to walk 14 miles back there, then load up our sleds and haul them back 14 miles, which were mighty long and hard ones. We've all been having a run of the meanest, nastiest, darndest colds that ever struck. And here you can see people starting to come down toward Bennett Lake. And here's a very unusual photograph. It's a sled being hauled by a goat. I'm not sure there are any other photographs that ever showed that kind of action up there. Now, once they got to Lake, it took them 29 days to build the boat that would take them down the Yukon River. And there were 10,000 Klondikers around the lake at the same time building their boats. Um, and who's ever built a boat? Did a kid from a farmer from New York or a kid from Brooklyn ever build a boat? Likely not. But to do so, they had to cut down trees, cut them into logs, then saw the logs into lumber to build the boat. And sails and rudders and oars and other companions were handmade. And these are two professional photographs, one showing the lake itself with all the campers around it, all making their boats. And this is an illustration of how many boats were being made. They were just side by side all over. Now, this is a whipsaw pit. This is how they converted the logs into lumber. And Odell said sawing planks was horrible work. And in his master of understatement way, he said, considerable difficulty and some profanity. And there is a top man and a bottom man, and the bottom man is showered with sawdust as the saw goes up and down. And here's the kind of boat they were making that looks pretty professional. We assume that maybe you were able to buy plans for a boat there, and that's how so many people learned what to do. And a remarkable coincidence, Odell's diary said, Tom Greer and Kristen, chums of Cornell 96-97, came to see us. Now here they are, many thousands of miles away in the heart of Yukon territory. They'd already made it over Chilkoot Pass that was so steep it dissuaded 70,000 of the prospectors to go home. And two friends from Cornell just happened to show up to say hello. And not only were they at the right place at the right time, somehow they found Odell and Aldrich amongst the 10,000 people. It's just one of those remarkable small world stories. So after the ice broke up on the Yukon River on May 29th, and most of the prospectors left at that time, and Odell and Aldrich were really frustrated because they were so far behind. They couldn't leave till they finished their boat on June 23rd. And on that date, they loaded their 3,000 pounds of supply in their boat on Bennett Lake and set sail down the dangerous Yukon River, traveling through five major sets of rapids to the Klondike goldfields. And after they left, it took them 33 days to reach Fort Selkirk, where they prospected instead of going on to Dawson, where, as many of the prime claims were already taken. And you can see what it is to load 3,000 pounds of gear on these small boats. Not much freeboard there. And you can imagine the lack of stability those boats had going down a dangerous river and through the rapids. This is the wonderful picture on the right. There was a Salvation Army tent that had this was the main entertainment at Bennett Lake. Every night they would sing songs and people would go and hear them, and you could learn about the evils of drink. Now, before they left Cornell, one of their friends gave them a Cornell pennant to take along. And when they built their boat, they put the Cornell pennant on the boat. When they built a cabin to stay over winter, they put it up there. They carried it back with them when they left the Yukon. And our grandfather had this at his hotel, at his house in Seattle. And the pennant is still with the family. So it was a proud possession of their trip. Now, going down the river, they had to register their vote at on Lake Taglish at the RCMP camp. And there you can see the registration. Their boat number 14,039, which means that 14,038 boats left before them that year. And there's the actual RCMP camp. And they're able to fish and replenish their food. And you can see how good the fishing was in Yukon territory in those days. Now, of the five rapids, the most dangerous were at Miles Canyon and Whitehorse Rapids. It was called the worst place on the Yukon. And it was so dangerous that the RCMP required the use of professional pilots to take stampeders' boats through the rapids. And the novelist Jack London worked as a pilot there during the gold rush, and he stayed and became one of the people that covered the gold rush. Uh, an entrepreneur named Norman Macaulay built a 5-mile wooden tram around the rapids, and his company transported freighted boats around the rapids for 3 cents a pound and $25 a boat. And his men, using 23 horses working around the clock, moved between 70 and 90 tons of freight around the rapids every day. And here you can see the wooden rails and his men at work. Now this is the boat going through Miles Canyon, which is the worst set of rapids. This is actually a professional photograph. But while they were there, another remarkable thing happened. Odell noted in his diary that they heard of Cornell's victory over Harvard and Yale at the 1898 IRA regatta. So not only previously had their chums from Cornell visited them at Bennett Lake, here, many miles in, they somehow got word of the latest crew race against Harvard and Yale at Poughkeepsie. It's remarkable how things happened in those days. Now, going down the river was treacherous, and several times their boat got stuck at a bar. Their goods got soaked, and they had to go on shore, and drying them took several days. Keep in mind, this wasn't just their clothing, but the sacks of flour, bacon, and everything else. And going down the river, they stopped and looked for places they could mine, different prospects. And this is a very unique picture, according to Steve. It shows it's a rare photo of sluice mining at Cassiar Bar, and there's no other record of any mining activity at that location in any of the accounts of the gold rush. And so this picture is probably the only thing that verifies that. Now, Odell, in his diary, took notes of a surprising number of fellow graduates of Ivy League schools they met at the trip. And of all the entries, here's my favorite one. During the trip downstream, Odell said they met Tom Wood, Yale of 96, who, when they saw him, was reading Cicero by the side of the river and later joined their party. Now, that's a real Ivy League experience in the wilds of the Yukon. This, according to Steve, is another very unique picture. This is called the Yukon Post Office, where the Little Salmon River comes into the Yukon. And it's basically a big board, and the prospectors, the stampeders, would leave notes for their friends who were either following them or would come out. And this was the main way of communication in the Klondike in those days. And the historians are flabbergasted when they see this picture because they'd never heard of that facility before. Now, it took them 33 days to go to Fort Selkirk, where they stopped and decided to mine. And this is a picture of Fort Selkirk that started out as a Hudson Bay store and later became an RCMP outpost. The Savoy Hotel there was the one hotel, and they got well acquainted with that because that's where they would stay coming back from the claim. And this is one of their pictures. On the back, it says, Walt Hoagland, a friend, which is our dog. Now, this is a map that Steve did that shows where they mined. And they mined on Wolverine Creek, which they said was 35 miles from Fort Selkirk. Fort Selkirk was, again, where the Pelly River comes into the Yukon. And the Dalton Trail, the northern branch that goes out of the Yukon, came right by their camp. And here is Odell's handwritten shopping list. Once they decided to stay, they had to provision for the winter. So Steve has retyped the stuff and it has all the provisions they need. And if you look down at the bottom, it's 4 panes of glass. So when they decided to overwinter and build a cabin, they bought glass for the windows at Fort Selkirk. Here's a picture. It says on the back, off on a prospecting trip out of Fort Selkirk. That's Odell on the right and Aldrich on the left. And they bought this buckskin horse they called Buck to help carry the provisions in. And look at the size packs they're wearing. You know, they're carrying perhaps almost as much as the horse itself. And Aldrich wrote about the difficult route into their mine. They had to go through quicksanded trails, deep with mud. And it was actually easier to get there over frozen terrain in the wintertime. And one of the things they had to do to overwinter was to build a cabin. So, which was a huge task in and of itself. You had to find the location, level it, cut down trees, bring the trees in, cut them into uh, logs they could use to build, uh, cut shingles for the roof, get moss to winterproof the spaces, and cutting firewood. They used firewood not only to heat the cabin and cook with, but they used it in their mining operation. So the amount of wood they had to cut is phenomenal. And this is a picture of Harry Granger, one of the partners, outside the cabin, wearing probably homemade snowshoes they needed to get around. Now, what they did was placer mining. And there are two kinds of mining. Hard rock mining is where you find a seam of gold or silver and use dynamite to break it up into pieces of rock that are later sent to a smelter to remove the minerals. The placer mining is where you find a river, a bend in a river, where over millions of years the gold and silver has been washed downstream and accumulates in the bend. And what you have to do is get down to bedrock. And outside of Fort Selkirk, bedrock was 35 feet down. And this is Steve's wonderful picture here. So to get down there, they had to dig and burn because this was all permafrost. So they dig whatever dirt there was, light a fire, it would melt the permafrost, they'd dig that out and repeat it all the way down to 35 feet. And once they get down there, they had to uh, dig out to look for the gold. And they built a winch and a windlass up here at top with a bucket. And that's how they got everything out, all the uh, soil and rocks. And that's how the men would get down and back. They would go down via the bucket. And this is the picture of Odell and Harry Granger placer mining at minus 40 degrees. You can see what it's like there. Not very pleasant. And they're bringing something up with that with the winch. And they had to put cribbing in so that the shaft would not cave in. And several times it caved in, capturing some of the miners down below, which was an emergency. And the men would hike regularly back to Fort Selkirk that they said was 35 miles away. And they've recorded times of between 11 and 14 hours. That seems awfully fast for 35 miles. So we're thinking that the 35 miles was not exactly accurate. But they built a shelter about halfway there to stay in case of an emergency. And it was too cold in the winter for boots. So they wore what they called German socks and moccasins. And in December, Ordell noted that his moccasins and socks wore through, so he had to wrap his feet in flour sacks to make the long walk. And these are pictures of actual moccasins and German socks that he brought back. Now, there are many, many Odell entries in his diary, and they discussed everything from the hard work involved in mining, the tedium and dangers of camp life, health problems, interactions with natives, and a challenging hike to Fort Selkirk, broken with occasional special times. For example, Christmas dinner 1898 had great old Christmas dinner, plum pudding, pies, cakes, game stew. That was the rare bit of happiness that he noted amongst the challenges they faced. And these are just a few of the entries that show how tough life was. 11:18, Walt and I started for Selkirk. They reached the shack. They broke an axe. Colder than blazes. Can't sleep. Walt has a chill. Keep a fire all night. Next day, start for Selkirk. Walt has difficult walking. Pretty hard pull getting to Selkirk. Holy smut, found it was 51 degrees below last night. 11:24, my feet tender and cracked like chapped hands, coming down with bad cold. And the next week or two, cold bad and feet ditto. Walt coming down with cold also. Rested and read all day, coughing like blazes meanwhile, with headache and general lassitude. Ellie and Harry began to feel effects of colds. All four have the tempers nicely. I coughed my head partly off. So this was not easy times up there. And in early January, he noted that the rope on the sack going down the shaft broke and two heavy logs fell on Walt's shoulder. He notes that very fortunately, only bruising him. And this was one of several of the cave-ins they had. And he notes that, the heavy logs falling him could have seriously injured or killed him. And again, in January, the difficulty of getting back and forth. Walt and I start from cabin 45 below. Walt gets feet wet in creek, build fire and dry. He tires out after leaving mid crossing. Stop, build fire, roast a little bread left. Rest 2 or 3 hours and push on slowly to the cabin. Now, this is extremely dangerous. Getting your feet wet at 45 degrees below is a death sentence. So you have to deal with the emergency, build a fire, dry things out, or they lost one of their partners. And it keeps going on. Storm all day, wind and snow, most heated one this winter. Dug and fired hole. 125. Trail drifted badly, difficult to follow, about 23 degrees below. 1:30. Start for cabin. New snow, hard walking. Reach cabin about 5. A little after, mighty tired. February 1st. Walt gives out almost halfway to Selkirk, so take 5 hours to come, last 2 hours distance. Get here at dark. Walt gives out completely after reach flats, 10 minutes from here. Stop, build fire, and rest. These are just some of the remarks that he tells. And they really are, their experiences remind one of Jack London's short story, To Build a Fire, and Robert Service's poem, The Cremation of Sam McGee. And here's some lines of Cremation of Sam McGee. On Christmas Day, we're mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold through the parka's fold. It stabbed like a driven nail. If our Irish weed cold, then the lashes froze until sometimes you couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. And here's a picture of one of the men on their way to Fort Selkirk and what he looked like with the ice in the beard. And here's another one of the men stopping to build a fire to make uh, lunch. And compare those with this. This is the cover on Jack London's story about To Build a Fire. Looks just like this guy. And there's Sam McGee, so tired he can hardly make it, and looks not unlike one of the Odell parties. So by the end of January, the men were totally exhausted by the rigors of mining gold in those brutal contact temperatures. Aldrich was a physically and emotionally beaten man with serious health issues. He needed to return home, but couldn't do it by himself. He had to have the assistance of Odell to leave. So in early February 1899, Odell decided to take Aldrich home, even though it was in the middle of winter, going on the Winter River Trail on top of the frozen Yukon River, a 400-mile trip. They started out by hauling their supplies to Fort Yukon to sell them. And on February 15th, the men began their difficult journey back to Skagway. And you can imagine this. Here's Aldrich, who's so sick he could hardly walk, had a hard time making it back and forth to their cabin. And they have to hike out 400 miles carrying their supplies. Those are just some rigors of the trip. This is the last picture taken at Wolverine Creek. And the back of it says, A Lonely Supper. And it shows Walt Hoagland, who, along with Granger, decided to stay and continue mining. And this shows what their cabin looked like. All the furniture was handmade. They had a stove, and you can see the curtains. Some of the panes of glass they brought from Selkirk were likely back there. And this is the men hauling their supplies to Fort Selkirk to sell them. And the back of the picture says regular horse work. And that's Odell. And I'm not sure which one is Aldrich and which one is Hoagland. And this is Odell's permission to leave Yukon Territory, signed by the RCMP, which was necessary to get out of the territory. Now, again, it was a 400-mile hike that took them 21 days from Fort Selkirk to Skagway on the Winter Trail from February 15th to March 8th. And the whole time they're walking in temperatures between 30 and 60 below zero, holding their supplies. And they took the Winter River Trail, where they hiked on the frozen Yukon River. Each day they hiked between 12 and 30 miles and slept in dirty, cramped bunkhouses, one of which Odell said was a bum place. And his diary indicates how bad the weather was and how tough the it was going and how exhausting it was. February 19th, blew and snowed all day, worst storm of the year. Next day, storm subsided and cold. Layover, waiting for the trail to open. Terrible trail. Feet blistered on bottom, could hardly walk last 12 miles. 44 below this morning. Very cold today. Feet very sore and legs lame. Feet very sore. Bad wind and sore on her back all day. Very bad storm. One of the things his diary yielded that Steve talked about is basically it's a travel log along the 400-mile trail that describes all of the bunkhouses that were available. And he gives you the distance between one and another, what it was called, and what it would cost to stay there. And of course, describe their conditions, one of which being a bum place. When they finally got to Selkirk, to Skagway, 400 miles from Fort Selkirk, they arrived on March 8th after another very hard travel day. And arriving there, they stayed at the Hotel Dewey, which was the best known and fanciest place in town. And they relaxed. They took turkey steam baths, bought medicine, new clothes, and threw away their old clothes. And in typical Odell fashion, he noted every penny that he spent. Drugs 50 cents, baths 150, so forth and so on. Every time he spent a penny, it would be recorded in his diary. Now, from Selkirk, the men took the steamboat Lorada back to Seattle, and it was the first boat bringing people out of the Klondike that spring, people who had overwintered. And the Seattle Times of March 23rd said, the steamship Lorada arrived in Seattle with $150 and $150,000 in Klondike gold. Odell and Aldrich are two New Yorkers who brought out considerable dust. And you can see the actual headline here on the left. And not too long later, the Cornell Sun, published at Cornell, said that Odell and Aldrich, both of the class of 98 College of Law, arrived not long ago on the steamer Lorada, which brought 150,000 in Klondike gold, the first shipment of the year. 9 miners brought gold, including Odell and Aldrich, who is estimated returned with gold amounting between $115,000 and $20,000. Now, $20,000 in 1899 is worth over $770,000 now in 2025 dollars. Now, keep in mind, any gold they found had to be split with Mr. Smith, who financed it. But Odell always insisted that he didn't make a fortune in the Yukon. So there's some question still about how much gold they found and brought out. And this is a great example of Steve's research and sleuthing. Not long after Odell and Aldrich arrived in Seattle, L.C. Smith of Osalaka, Florida, where Smith had a winter home, was staying at the Hotel Diller in Seattle. Presumably, he knew when they were coming home, so he met them and divided up whatever proceeds there were. Now, when they got back to Seattle, Aldrich went right back to Cornell and finished law school and ended up practicing law in the East for the rest of his life. Odell, on the other hand, stayed in Seattle and worked initially as a ticket agent for the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and later became a contractor. But the Seattle into which he arrived was totally transformed. Said that the gold rush changed Seattle from a remote town in the far west to a major economic force on the Pacific coast. And you look at the population growth, almost 43,000 in 1890, over 80,000 in 1900. But by 1910, it reached 237,000. Again, all products of the gold rush. By the spring of 1898, more than 25 million had been spent on the Yukon trade in Seattle, Again, as I pointed out, worth over $963 million in today's dollars. And that made fortunes for Seattle merchants. And by the dawn of the new century, Seattle had established itself as a premier city of the Northwest. By the end of the century, Seattle assayers exchanged more than $18 million in gold, worth nearly $600 million in 2025 dollars. And again, all that money were the foundations of the fortunes of a number of Seattle merchants. So Odell ended up being a contractor specializing in concrete work. And he built a number of large and small public and private projects. Among other things, he paved the city's sidewalks in Pioneer Square, built new buildings in downtown area, rebuilt the Port Blakely sawmill after it burned down in 1907, paved the Montlake Cut portion of the Lake Washington Ship Canal, built the Canadian Pacific steamship wharfs and railroad station in Vancouver, paved the streets of the Highlands north of Seattle, and paved a portion of Snoqualmie Pass through the Cascade Mountains. Because a lot of the work he was doing was significant, his work was oftentimes described in the paper. And you can see one example at the bottom there. Seattle Times, November 17th, 1911, talks about a contract he had to build an ice manufacture and storage plant, which was basically on the Seattle waterfront, and he had to work underwater. The excavation for the building went down 7.5 feet below the city datum, requiring pumping out water, installing 1,200 pilings, and 1,000 cubic yards of waterproof concrete. And he was the first person who actually used waterproof concrete in the Seattle area. And there's Odell in his office, smoking the pipe that he always had. And there's an advertisement for his company. Now, his mentor, L.C. Smith, took advantage of the growth in Seattle, and he built a building named after himself, the Smith Tower. There it is under construction. It was finished in 1914, and that's what it looked like thereafter. And until the 1960s, it was the tallest building west of the Mississippi and was really a monument to Seattle's growth. One of Odell's lasting legacy is that he helped start the University of Washington crew. And he was a proud rower and always kept his Cornell rowing affiliations open. In 1905, Odell and others bought an 8-oared shell for the University of Washington from Cornell that allowed the UW to compete at a varsity level. And the UW newsletter said UW is now in a position to become the Cornell of the West. In 1906, the University of Washington athletic director recruited 2 experienced rowers, Mark Odell and George Strange, to coach the UW crew, which they did. And in 1907, when a person who later became famous, Hiram Conabear, became the crew coach, there was a problem. He never rowed. So it was lucky for Conabear and the UW that Odell continued to assist him and the crew program, teaching him the Courtney stroke that he'd learned at Cornell. And Lord Grinstead recognized their contributions in 1923. He said when Connie took over as crew coach in 1907, his rowers had learned their skill from Washington's earlier coaches, and those rowers passed their knowledge to the new coach. Among whom this writer remembers vividly was Mr. Hughes and silent Mark Odell, who contributed their mite to its retirement, to its refinements. And this is the latest we could find when Odell was affiliated with the UW crew program. This was the UW-Cal dual meet in 1922. This is Odell here, and he was the race steward, which meant he was in charge of all the races. And you can see that UW beat California by 10 boat lengths in that race. And the competition between UW and Cal continues to this day. UW beat Cal 3 weeks ago in a dual regatta here. They lost to them last weekend at the Mountain Regional Championships. and then meet again in 2 weeks in the IRA championships in the East Coast. And they're rated number one and number two of the country. So that competition continues. Now, there's been a lot of talk about um, the genesis of what was called the Conybeare stroke that was associated with Hiram Conybeare. And Peter Mallory, who's a rowing historian, wrote a 4-volume history of rowing published in 2011. And he spoke to that. He said it wasn't George Pocock who developed it. It'd be more accurate to say that the Conybeare stroke was a result of crucial early consultation with Cornell coach Charles Courtney, reinforced by having former Cornell rower Mark Odell as a voluntary assistant in Washington program. Add in the influence George Pocock, and the Conybeare stroke has everything, and Conybeare had everything he needed to supplement his own innate intelligence. So that is a lasting contribution that Odell made to local community. And of course, Boys in the Boat, Dan Brown's wonderful book, and the resulting movie talks about their success in the 1936 Olympics. Now, this is the last slide here. Odell was born in 1869, shortly after the Civil War was over, and died in 1963 at age 94. And this is a picture from the 1920s when he was a businessman, again, smoking his pipe. And this is how he looked in his later age when Steve and I knew him. He was a courtly gentleman that was a big influence in both of our lives. And in 1960, in a very modest way, he wrote in an article to a relative back in New York. He was asked to describe his year at the Klondike. And he said, "A year of wonderful adventures and experiences. But remember, there are thousands upon thousands of people who did this in 1897 and 1898. In Seattle, above tail is commonplace." So he didn't want to take credit for some really tough adventures, but he said, no big deal. A lot of us out here did it. And that reflected how gentle and self-effacing he was. So that's the presentation. The book is available through Amazon, and I've just touched on the surface tonight for the pictures and the description. So there's an awful lot more along these same lines that's available. And we could say some questions now if anyone has them. Anthony, did anyone type in some questions?
Not yet. For our audience, if you have any questions, you can enter them now in the chat. If you're not sure what the chat button is, you can look down the lower bar. You should see a chat icon. Please feel free to type in your questions, and then I will relay them to the authors.
And Steve, if you have any supplemental remarks, jump in, because you were primarily responsible for this book and did a lot of the research. You have to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment.
I did. Well, thank you, John, for the great summary you did. One thing about this book, you mentioned the Winter River Trail, which is essentially the frozen Yukon River. And essentially nothing has been written about that. And this book has a lot of details on it, including a table that shows all the stops, how far they were apart. And it was only really in use for 2 years. That is to get out of the Yukon during the winter, because in the fall, before the ice really formed, you couldn't get on the river. It was too dangerous. And in the spring, it melted and it was too dangerous. So for about 3 months, the only way in or out was over the Winter River Trail. And essentially nothing has been written about this. And that's one of the very unique things in this book. And that most of the stops are gone. They don't know exactly where they were. They vanished because it was only used for 2 years, because the government up in the Yukon Territory built a trail on the land that could be used in the winter and that started to be used in 1901 or 1902. So in effect, this unique route out and in to the Yukon during the winter was only used for a few years. And you won't read about that anywhere else. I've read over 30 books about the Yukon Gold Rush, Klondike Gold Rush, and I never came across that until I looked at my grandfather's diary, our grandfather's diary, and I transcribed it in 1987. That's the year I climbed over Chilkoot Pass. And it's really something to climb over that pass. There's two faults summits that you think you've made it to the top, and then you go almost horizontally again and then up again. It's really discouraging. And you can imagine these guys hauling all their gear over there, over those boulders. Of course, when they went, it was rock, it was ice steps that were carved in the trail, and they would have a pole on their left hand. They grab onto a rope that went the distance, and if they stepped out, it took them sometimes 4 or 5 hours to get back in the line because people wouldn't let them in. It was every person for him or herself. It was quite grueling. And so those are some added little points that I think are pretty interesting.
As I mentioned before, Steve did a lot of original research for this book, and there are 5 separate appendices in the back. And we saw that at the beginning of the slideshow. And the Winter River Trail is just one of them. So there's significant original research and writing in this book.
We do have some questions in the chat. The first one is asking, was wildlife like bears ever a problem for them?
Steve,
They never wrote about the bears, but this is quite ironic. When they arrived at Fort Selkirk, at Fort Selkirk, his diary talks about a couple of moose swimming across the river. In the about 2005, when I was up there, I took a boat. By the way, Fort Selkirk is totally abandoned now. It's just kind of an archaeological site in the summer, and you have to take a boat to get down there. And as we came into Fort Selkirk, there was a moose swimming across the river. I couldn't believe it. But what it was, that must be a natural crossing for moose to go across the river there. He didn't really talk a lot about the wildlife. And now Wolverine Creek was probably named after wolverines, who are they're the largest weasel there is. I think they can be 50, 60 pounds, and they're vicious. They'll chase grizzly bears. They're so tough. But he never mentioned that, but clearly the creek had to have been named after Wolverine at one time. But essentially they got birds that they would shoot or actually sometimes with a hatchet they would kill ptarmigan. But they had a rather varied diet up there, as evidence in that shopping list. On something else, you notice in there it said NY territory. Well, Yukon territory.
NWST, I think. Northwest.
Yes. Yukon territory was created when they were going down the river in the boat. And I don't know if they ever realized that they were in Yukon territory when they arrived, because it's Northwest Territory is what their records keep saying. And that's just kind of an odd little coincidence.
The men must have hunted for provisions, and I'm sure they would go after deer and moose and elk and reindeer that you'd find around there. But there's no mention of that in the diary. So the diary was more focused on the work they were doing and the people they met and the health of the miners. So they didn't really talk a lot about what they did to get fresh meat.
The questions is how long did the research happen? In trying to trace it, I transcribed the diary in 1987, and the book is just published now, but I obviously didn't work on it the whole time. Uh, but our grandfather, he was very stoic and he wouldn't talk about things unless you just asked him questions. And for example, gold, the natural question is, did you get gold? And oh no, we didn't get any. And he'd show this little vial in his basement, and it was about as big as your index finger. And there was just like two BBs worth of gold in the bottom of it. And that was it. And then I just about fell out of my chair when I found those articles claiming that he brought out a lot of gold. But remember, Mr. Smith would have gotten most, if not all, the gold. And there are no records I could find about bringing gold out, anybody bringing gold out, but there was a fee that you had to pay the Canadians. And I'd never found a record of any miner paying those fees to bring out gold, but they probably just smuggled it out.
Yeah, Canada taxed the goods as they went in and tried to tax the gold as they went out. And they could maintain control over the border and examine the goods you'd bring in. And they required people to bring sufficient supplies to last a year, which was between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds apiece. Odell and Aldrich brought, they say, 3,000 pounds together. But again, that was bulky, and you had to have it actually weighed before you could get in. But bringing gold out, and much of what they found there was gold dust and small pieces of gold, not large pieces. So you could easily hide that in, your equipment, your um, on your body, or anything else you're coming out. So it's interesting, even though they had the tariff on gold taken out, no one apparently paid anything.
We got another question in the chat. Uh, it's asking, did the diary make mention of when they found the gold that they took back to Seattle?
That's kind of interesting because I can't remember exactly, but there are like 9 or 12 entries when it found a PR of nuts, and that was a pair of nuggets, is what that would be. The book was so small, he couldn't really write expansively. And it doesn't really talk about a lot of gold. And yet, there are all these articles about them bringing out a lot of gold. You know, I don't know which is true. If you believed him, he brought out almost no gold. Um, uh, and that was Aldrich's story too. They adamantly denied that they brought out a lot of gold. On the other hand, he lived a moderately well-to-do life in Seattle and made some money uh, as a contractor. Our mother told us that in 1923 he went broke trying to pave Snoqualmie Pass. And I can't find any records of that, but our uncle, her brother, talked about that too. And he must have been a subcontractor and gave a bad bid and lost everything and really lost his economic status in Seattle. And it's kind of interesting that his wife, our grandmother, went to work selling life insurance, and she supported the family for I don't know how many years, several years. So that must have been a big come down for him. And then he got a job. She sold life insurance. He sold general insurance a few years later, but they never made it back into the wealth that they had both aspired to.
But keep in mind, when he opened up his contracting business in the early 1900s, he appeared to have a significant grub stake. I mean, he started fairly quickly working on large projects. And, he was variously identified as a civil engineer and an architect in the Seattle papers that described a lot of his work. But he was neither. He actually had a liberal arts degree. He called himself a man of letters. Yet he immediately started building these large and sophisticated buildings and projects where you just don't hang your shingle up and have people come. So if you look at that evidence, it showed he likely had a pretty substantial grub stake to set up his own business in the early 1900s. And he was definitely part of what was called the social set. All the newspapers in those days had society pages. And, the in people, their whole lives were discussed in the society pages. And he was in the society pages all the time. He was an early member of the Seattle Tennis Club. He was a member of the Writing Club. All of the grand balls and parties he was invited to. And when they got married in 1910, and all of a sudden they were, one of the most socially prominent couples around. Every time our grandmother had a tea or a bridge party, there'd be a lengthy description in the society pages saying who was there, what they were wearing, what jewelry they were wearing. That was just the way newspapers and society operated in those days. So clearly, until he had problems on Suquamish Pass, he had very large projects and seemingly made quite a bit of money from his construction projects.
Well, and John, remember that article we found about the first year they were married, they were house sitting for someone that was having a year-long tour in Europe. I forget the name of the people in this really big mansion. And there was a robbery where somebody came when our grandmother was having women over with tea for tea, and the guy put a ladder up and got into the second story, and it said stole $12,000, $10,000 worth of jewelry that she had. Well, she came from a modest family and taught school. Where did this come from? Assuming the article was true.
Yeah.
So that's another evidence that maybe he had some gold.
Yeah. Well, and that was the Chapin family or the Henry family. And Mr. Henry was the main contractor for the Milwaukee Railroad. Was built from Chicago to Seattle, arriving in 1909. And he later became a contractor around here and was a big, he gave money for the Henry Gallery at the University of Washington, the art gallery. And they were good friends of our grandparents. So that was the social set that they were involved with. So all those indicators are that, he had money and he used that money to make more money.
One aspect, he was absolutely anti-drinking. I mean, he just thought alcohol was a scourge. And that was, he was known in Cornell as a real rabble rouser, and it probably was opposing liquor. And we believe, I think the story is that our grandfather's uncle lost his farm because of alcoholism, and that made an indelible mark, no pun intended, his name was Mark, it left an indelible mark on Mark, and he just did not like drinking. And another interesting story, the woman that he married, she was kind of the belle of the ball, so to speak, a Seattle school teacher, and on the first faculty, by the way, at Lincoln High School. But in any event, I kept asking my mother and her brother, who outlived her, do you know anything about your mother's family? No, they didn't know anything about it. Well, I found a newspaper article that in let's see, our grandmother's mother was listed in the 1920 census as living in their house. Now, my mother would have been 4 at that time, and her brother would have been 6. And neither one of them remembered this woman being there. And I also found some articles about her. She was divorced early in her marriage, like in 1890 or something like that. And her husband left her, I guess, and she kept the house and had a rooming house where there were like 4 or 5 extra bedrooms that women would rent. Well, in the late teens, she was arrested for running a whorehouse, and she claimed that she didn't know what was going on in the rooms, and that must have really been quite embarrassing for her daughter and son-in-law. But they kept her in the house for a year,
But that
and
was back in where, Nebraska or someplace like that, was that? Iowa.
in Iowa,
Yeah.
in Iowa,
Well,
and
when I was doing research about the family, all the times in PI are scanned, so you can do simple word searches. And I put in our family's name, and between 1910 and 1930, there are at least 400 mentions of the family in both the newspapers. And a lot of it had to do with our grandfather's building projects because they were large and sophisticated and cutting edge. But probably more, as I mentioned before, were about our grandmother in the social pages because, people of that social set entertained all the time. And both, the society pages in those days were like 4 or 5 pages and they had their own section. And they had, 3 or 4 uh, society reporters whose only job it was to keep track of the social set, see what they're doing, find out who's having a party, and write about it. So it was this self-sustaining system of finding out who the society people were, and then keeping them in the news to make sure they kept their status in society. So it's such a totally different world from that which we live in now. It's fascinating to go back and see that.
We have another question in the chat. Why did Odell stay in Seattle and did not return to New York with Aldrich?
You want to take that, Steve?
I don't know specifically, but I think he just felt he wanted a new life out in the West, and there was a lot of economic opportunities in Seattle, as John mentioned in his presentation. I mean, it was just incredible, the growth in Seattle. And by the way, there's a great quote that one author said is, Seattle mined the miners. In other words, by selling everything to them, they made the money, and the miners basically didn't, most of them didn't make any money. And that's, I mean, Seattle it was a great geographic location, but they had a very aggressive pursuit of selling stuff throughout all Puget Sound, both kind of mail order, and people would take boats to Seattle to buy stuff. Seattle also had a lot of booze, more than the other communities, gambling and prostitution. That was a huge moneymaker for Seattle, and basically all that stuff had to go on down in south of Pioneer Square. North of there, where the society lived, you couldn't have it, but they cut a deal. And I think in 1870 or 80, a tax on seamstresses brought in 80% of Seattle's revenue. And there was something in a city of, I can't remember, like 20,000, there was something like 800 seamstresses, and they had to pay like 25 bucks a month. Well, come on. You can guess what a seamstress was.
Probably going back to New York, Matt, he would rejoin Aldrich and study law. And I think at that point, he was no longer interested in being a lawyer. He'd experienced a pretty amazing year in the Klondike, and he saw the economic opportunities from Seattle. As Steve said, for the first 2 decades of the 20th century, this was the boomtown of the whole country. Fortunes were being made, and he saw a niche where he could be a contractor. And public projects were remodeling the city, and there are a huge number of private projects and buildings. So I think it was a lifestyle and economic decision he made, that he saw his future here as a contractor rather than as a lawyer back in New York.
By the way, in some of his records, in between the summer of 1897 and between when they graduated undergraduate school and started law school, he traveled and looked like audited a civil engineering coursework. Uh, and he has all these pictures of I forget the guy's name, but it was Professor XYZ. I don't remember what it was, but um, that may be where his interest in construction came from. And again, there was no licensing, I don't believe, in those days for an architect or an engineer. And people just put out their shingle and claim there are these things. And I'm sure he was not above the self-publicity, and he wouldn't correct people if they thought he mentioned that he was an engineer or an architect, which he was not either one. But he made, I think, very good money until he lost it, like my mother said, trying to pave Snoqualmie Pass. And as I recall, Snoqualmie Pass was just a trail, and then about 1918, it was made into a dirt road where you could get wagons across. And so this was trying to pave it. Uh, and I'm talking about just the couple miles around the actual pass itself. It was, I mean, you can hardly believe what it was like 100 years ago.
But you look at some of the projects he worked on, and they are very sophisticated and large. Um, he rebuilt the Port Blakely lumber mill, which at the time was one of the largest lumber mills in the state of Washington. It's a huge project using the waterproof concrete to make the ice manufacturing building underwater was absolutely sophisticated. And one of his big projects was in Canada. He was hired by the Canadian Pacific Railroad to build new wharves and a new waterfront railroad station as they were expanding west. And that was a huge project. He spent 2 full years up there. So he was not just, pounding nails and sawing lumber. He was somehow designing and building very large, very sophisticated projects. And again, where that skill came from, who knows? But it certainly led to an opulent life. And he had a nice, very large house on Capitol Hill, and they had servants, and lived a high style of life.
So our cousin, Mark Odell, named after our grandfather, obviously, he wrote that his father, Burr, was born in Vancouver in 1914. And I know that I remember the story that he didn't have a first name. He was just like a boy born. And it was several days later that he was named Burr, who was after our grandfather's brother. So he was, our cousin Mark's father was named after our grandfather's brother. And there was a story he told me that in World War II, he wanted to become an officer and you had to be an American citizen. And he had trouble proving he was an American citizen because he was born in Vancouver, BC. And he had to get proof that either his mother or father was born in the United States. And he used his mother's birth records in Iowa to prove that. Oh, and Mark said that he was originally called Paul instead of his father was originally called Paul instead of Burr. I wasn't aware of that.
Anything else?
I agree the comment about the diary. I bet he was not, they didn't want to publicize where they were. And by the way, wherever you would file the claims for mining back then, unfortunately, those records in the area around Fort Selkirk were burned, uh, were destroyed in a fire in the early 1950s. But there was no mention in the diary of filing a claim. Now, he was a conservative man. If they found gold, you'd think they would have filed a claim about that, but I couldn't find anything about that.
Well, thank you so much. You're a very attentive audience. We really appreciate your sticking with us. And, feel free to contact Steve or me if you have any follow-on questions. If you get a copy of the book, we'd be happy to meet and sign it for you.
Thank you so much, John and Steve. And thank you so much to our audience for coming out tonight and joining us online. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the support. Thanks again to everyone, and I hope everybody has a good night.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks.
Thank you.